Welcome back, one and all, to Mystic Radio. I am your host, Spirit Lady Robin Alexis. And remember, Mystic Radio is always an experience, not an explanation. It is up to you to discern if what you hear rings true to you or not. We are not telling you what to think. We just are encouraging you to know, trust, and act upon your own knowing. So, what's going on with Mystic Radio? We had ended it after 19 years, and then I met Ken Sylvester. And this is how it happened. I wrote an Amazon best-selling book called A Conversation with Extraterrestrials, and I wanted to learn more about other authors who wrote about the subject. So I was guided to purchase Amazon best-selling book, We're Not Alone, and Here's the Proof by Ken Sylvester. And I got to tell you, my mind was blown reading this book. And frequently, the extraterrestrials that he was writing about would begin to speak with me telepathically. And I'd already been communicating with the mantis being called called A Conversation with Extraterrestrials. I'm getting all confused here for a moment. Something just jumped into my field, which I told you, this show is an experience. So, it's Maxwell. So on the last show, we were letting Maxwell speak through me. He was talking to our guest, Ellen Kuhl, who is a guest on today's show too. But I want to go back to how, if you're interested in the two books that we're discussing on the show, they're on Amazon, and you go to Ken Sylvester, We're Not Alone, and Here's the Proof, and you can look at his book and see if you're intrigued with that. And then you can also look up A Conversation with Extraterrestrials by Robin Alexis. And again, during the last show, I was channeling Mantis being Maxwell, who is the one I was having a conversation with and wrote the book that I just talked about. And so he's jumping in. He was on the last show, and he was offering a healing to the guest, Dr. Ellen Kuhl, who we'll bring back on in a moment. And one of the things that came up at the end of the show was discernment. And Maxwell had offered to do a healing to Dr. Kuhl, and she had said she was not comfortable with that if she was going to have a healing like that, she trusted me because she had listened to Mystic Radio for about 15 years, and she knows my type of skill set. So I'll bring Ellen on in a moment, and we'll wrap up the conversation with Maxwell, and then we're going to bring on Ken Sylvester to talk about a chapter called Zimbabwe in his book. So we're going to go to Ellen first. So welcome, Dr. Ellen Kuhl, for coming back on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me back.
And I'm sorry I got a little rattled. And we were also talking on the last show that it's difficult to, maintain the human consciousness and life stream, and then also communicate with these beings. So Maxwell, again, is thanking you, Ellen, for being willing to talk to him so graciously. And he is encouraging people, if they haven't listened to all of our Mystic Radio with Robin Alexis shows concerning this subject, he's asking for people to go ahead and listen to all the shows, because Maxwell, is saying there's going to be a lot of extraterrestrial contact and communication with people coming soon to this planet, and that people are going to need to know where to feel safe. And you can feel safe coming to the show and speaking with Robin, Ken, and their special guest. So now he is departing. So let's bring on Ken Sylvester. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, Robin. Thank you for that. Going back to, as we were ending the last show, I also, you always ask the questions, and I like a chance to just ask you a couple of questions as we're getting to know each other. First, I'd like to tell the audience that right now you're living out in Mt Shasta, which if they Google that, they'll find that Mt Shasta has a lot of high strangeness, a lot of paranormal, UFO sightings, encounters with aliens. It's considered, if you watch Skinwalker Ranch, it's Skinwalker Ranch on steroids. And she lives at a house that's built right into Mt Shasta. In what, if you can picture that after you see what this beautiful mountain looks like. And I'm in a senior community here with seniors, and we have plenty of our own high strangeness here. One question I was curious about, you started to explain about clairvoyance, and I wondered if you could explain to us the difference between clairvoyance and clairaudient.
Oh, I'm really glad you asked that question. And I do actually want to go back to what you brought up about Mt Shasta. That's actually a whole show we can do on how we even wound up living in Mt Shasta. But Mt Shasta, the story I'm going to tell you is that when I first met my husband, which was 24 years ago today, he and I were on a Carolyn Miss tour that was going to Ireland and England, where she had people she was teaching how to open up to their own gifts. And I noticed we were in a church, a Salisbury church in England, and I saw this man was crying with, tears just running down his cheeks. He was sitting in a pew, and I just walked up very, very quietly and kneeled down next to him, and I put my hand on his knee, and I whispered, I said, I think you're having a past life memory. May I help you? And he said, yes. So I gave him a past life reading, and he had a soul retrieval from a past life that he actually had in that particular church. So then I went about my business. And so when we were all outside of the church, he walked up to me, and he handed me his business card. And he said, 28 years ago, I was told by an astrologer I was going to meet a woman like you, and I was supposed to offer her her own radio show. And he handed me his business card, and he said, when we get back to the States, I want to fly you to Beverly Hills, where I live, and I'm going to want to bring you to the station, and we're going to get you a radio show. And that is what happened. So I lived in New Hampshire. He lived in Beverly Hills. And when we got home from that trip, I flew to L.A. He brought me to the radio station, and that's how this all began. And this is the anniversary date of that moment in that church 24 years ago. So happy fall equinox, everybody, and happy anniversary to Bob, because basically I've been with him since then. We can talk more about that, but I will tell you that when he realized I could do past life readings, he looked at me and he said, but what you're really going to do is be an extraterrestrial medium. He said, someday the world's going to be ready for you to talk ETs, and that's what you're going to talk about on Mystic Radio. And we went through the whole 19 years of Mystic Radio, and that wasn't what happened. We ended it, and then I met Ken, and here we are. So thank you for asking about Mt Shasta, because Bob said we had to move to Mt Shasta so that I could do the ET thing. And like I said, that whole thing will be another show. The difference between clairvoyant and clairaudient is if you're clairvoyant, you can see things without your physical eyes. There's like another eye. One of the places is in your forehead, and you see things almost like on a TV screen in your forehead. Or as you develop that skill set, you can actually, like I said, you can see things with your eyes open. So you see it with that third eye, but you also see it with your physical eyes. Clairaudient is you hear things telepathically. And it's very important telepathically, higher self to higher self, meaning that it's fifth dimension or higher, meaning it causes no harm to you or anyone else. So if someone is communicating to you telepathically and it's more on a psychic level than the higher octaves, that's when people can like put thoughts in your head, or you can put thoughts in their head, which is kind of what Maxwell was talking about in the previous show. You want to maintain your own sovereignty, your own energy, manage your own energy, and make decisions that are in the highest good for yourself. Do you understand what I just said, Ken?
Oh, yes, definitely. Thanks for clearing that up.
Sure. And Ellen, is there anything you want to say before we hear these interesting stories from Ken?
Just congratulations to you and Bob.
Oh, thanks, Ellen. All right. So, Ken, I'm super, super excited. What have you got to share with us today?
Well, probably one of my favorite stories, because even when I was researching it, there was so much overwhelming, compelling evidence, more than any story I believe that I have in the book. When I saw the videos that were made, there were several videos, but one of them by James Fox, who had done a documentary on Zimbabwe. And he shows a live interview with these students. And you can see their little faces and telling their stories. And it just is so compelling, and you can tell that they're telling the truth. And that actually is the conclusion. They were interviewed first by Tim Leach from the BBC, who was a correspondent in Zimbabwe for BBC. They also were interviewed by Cynthia Hine, who is a Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, so it's a local. And she also was part of MUFON in doing an investigation. Another witness, which we didn't find out until later in the research, was a guy named Za. Za was only 5 years old at the time this occurred, and he did not get interviewed because they thought he was too young. Well, then 20 years later, which we'll get to shortly, he grew up and became a reporter. And he interviewed, when they did these interviews 20 years later, and he interviewed the students for the first time and then admitted that he also was a witness to that. And then the most other compelling part was by Dr. Mack. He interviewed all the students. He interviewed them individually, 68 students, and he's a professional. He's in charge of the head psychiatrist at Harvard University at the time, and he had interviewed thousands of people, all related to UFO abductions and sightings. So when they showed the interviews of these kids, and all of them concluded, all 5 different people that got interviewed, that the kids were definitely telling the truth. Even when they came back 20 years later and re-interviewed them, they still got the same story. And they also had them draw pictures. And they had saved some of the pictures from when they were in elementary, going back 20 years, and they redrew the pictures again, and all the students' pictures, they all matched. So it was a very believable story, but extremely with the cover-ups and the bizarre stories that were told, about the different cover-ups that occurred, which we'll get to also shortly. Excuse me a second here. So when I do my research, I just want to briefly explain how I go about it. I got mentioned on there that they thought they weren't very impressed that I had used Wikipedia. I did use that, but only as a backup. In other words, to confirm information. Theirs was normally very, it just gave a lot of the dates and times and witnesses and things of that nature. So I basically used that to just confirm other information that I had. And in this case, there were over 20 videos to watch on Zimbabwe. I watched most of them, and this is true with the other stories too. I take in any podcast, any video, trying to get all the information and also gather the information from the internet, then review it, compare stories, and when I got matches and at least 3 confirmations around the same information, then I considered that to be factual enough to publish. And one other thing that was out there this whole time that made it a little bit difficult was the disinformation that's put out there. All the internet stories occasionally would throw 1 or 2, kind of like they're trying to make a cover story, but they would do a parallel story, and the information would be slightly different than the original story that I had concluded was the truth. And most of these were put out by the government to give out disinformation, to confuse UFO researchers, to frustrate them, and hopefully keep the secrets. Some of the cover-up stories that were used for this, and most of them all start with a kernel of truth. But then they were suggesting that all the kids had done, it was just mass hysteria. Another one said this was caused because there was a traveling puppet show, which was really silly. And one more was about the good old weather balloon. Now, what happened when the students were out during recess, and there's going to be 6 school stories told, and almost all of them, the aliens were being very observant. They had scanned the area 2 days before. People saw sightings of them. And they figured out that the best time it seemed to go see children was during recess when they're out playing and they're nice and relaxed. They felt very safe around them. So they land on a field just adjacent to where the school play yard is. And a ramp comes down and 2 aliens walk out. They're grays and they are wearing a black uniform. So they're really fashionable on their first visit to these kids. They wanted to really impress them. And then the kids went on to say, yeah, they all had big heads and they had big eyes and they had a little nose and a slit for the mouth. And they were about the same size as the aliens. And one of the aliens stepped towards the children and one girl stepped towards the alien. They almost were within handshaking distance. And then they did something kind of funny. The students were kind of jumping around, and so the aliens start imitating them, and they start jumping around. And so they created a common bond with them, and these kids that were up front felt safe, and they were extremely curious as to what was going on. Some of the kids ran back into the school to tell the teachers. The teachers didn't believe them, told them to sit down and shut up and go back to work. And then we had the students out there that were firsthand up close to the aliens, and then the ones that stand back a little bit and took notes. Soon after that, then they were confronted with having to tell their parents. And one very frustrating thing for all the kids is most all the parents, they didn't believe their stories. And this made the kids kind of upset and angry, and it kind of traumatized them. First of all, they had just seen a UFO sighting. Then they see a flying saucer land, and then aliens get out and start talking to them. So they were a little traumatized just by that. But then they now had to deal with the parents and them not believing them. Even when they went back 20 years later and re-interviewed them, kids still had trouble convincing their parents that this was indeed a true story. Now, while the aliens were on the ground, they said they came here to deliver a message. And the basic message is that, mankind is screwing up. They're messing up the planet. And that they were hoping that the kids, I think, in teaching them at this young age, that hopefully they might grow up one day and be able to contribute and help and correct some of these things. So telepathically, they start receiving messages. And they were like, they showed it when they showed the video, they showed like they were seeing, like you mentioned, actually seeing a picture in their minds. And the first picture they showed them was a black smoke that was bellowing out of these smokestacks. It reminded me of an area in Pennsylvania where there's nothing but factories all over in an entire circle, and you see all this smoke going up. And that was the message about how we're polluting the planet. The next one, they saw a scene where a city had just been bombed by nukes, and that how we are so careless with our nukes, and we have so many of them. There's over 15,000 nuclear weapons still in the world, and that this was also a danger. Then they showed pollution, and that was shown with, they showed a running stream with, beer cans and pop cans and McDonald's wrappers, in the streams. And so that was based on the water pollution. And the last one, and this one was also kind of funny, was about the tech pollution of the teenagers. Now, for a while, I had custody of my granddaughter. I was 67 at the time, and she lived with me from 14 to 16. And she would come home from school, and I could go in her room at any time, and she was always on her phone. Or she had her headphones on and was playing a video game. And they said also how that has gotten a bit out of control, that the teenagers and young adults were spending too much time on technical issues. Not technical issues, on videos and games. And it's basically kind of like tech pollution.
This is stirring me deeply. I know you, Ken, too, had an experience as a child, and yours was traumatizing also. And so I would imagine that other people who are listening to the show who had an experience like this and then tried to, get support and be able to live with what we just had. It's interesting, Maxwell in the other show was talking about trauma and how it affects our ability to be sovereign and have communication with extraterrestrials. So the fluidity of this show is fascinating to me. Ken, is there anything else you want to say? If there is, please do. And then I want to go to Ellen and see, with her doctorate degree, what she wants to say about this.
Well, there is a bit more to cover on Zimbabwe, and also want to ask you about your experience that you had when you were 6 years old. And maybe on our next show that we can go to that and you can describe to them what happened with your incident at 6 years old.
Yeah.
Right now, I give it back to you to speak with Ellen.
Okay. So, Ellen, you've read the chapter. You're hearing what Ken is saying, and you're a doctor trained in consciousness with kids. What do you think about this whole thing?
I think that the kids are quite comfortable with other species beings from all over the cosmic world, and the experience in Zimbabwe of fear was just because it's unknown, and again, I think it's just conditioning. But I think they were probably, from reading the chapter, it sounds to me like they were open and receptive and welcoming, the ones that stayed, and curious. And it's usually the adults and the grown-ups that bring in the fear of the unknown.
And didn't you find it interesting that they did go to children that were under the age 8, which I believe you said that. So could you tell the audience why that is also significant?
Because prior to age 8, the scientists or the science shows that cognition in human brain development is still not able to do many of the skills that come with that type of intellectual thinking. And so prior to that, the children are really curious, open, energetic, non-judgmental. And so they chose children that age group because they knew that they would be accepting. And they did. They got the message.
And then the adults messed it all up.
Yes. That's what it
sounds
like.
about right.
So Ken, you said you had more things to say about Zimbabwe.
Yes, but I think we're nearing the end of our time.
Okay. Then we'll save a bit more Zimbabwe information from Ken in the next show, and we can talk about probably my earliest experience when I was 6, which actually isn't in the book, A Conversation with Extraterrestrials. That happened when I was 11. The one that happened when I was 6, which I have to say, Ken, was the same dates. When I was abducted by the Greys, it was sometime between September 19th and September 20th. And when I read the chapter, those are the same kind of dates that the Zimbabwe kids around it wasn't the same year, but it was around fall equinox. So I found that very, very interesting. And then also that when Cindy, Cindy was when I was 11, but when I was 6 years old, I was the only one that even remembered the incident, and it wasn't until I was 10 that my mom brought out a magazine that on the front cover, it had a picture of Betty and Barney Hill, who were talking about they had been abducted on those same dates. And prior to that, my mother was furious at me and was always telling me, shut up, don't talk about that, you have too big of an imagination, there's something wrong with you. And then she saw that magazine, and she bought it, and she read the article, and she was like, oh my God. And the other thing that I want to say before we end this particular show, Ken, is that my parents and myself, we were also hypnotized and interviewed by Dr. John Mack because of the different abduction experiences I had as a child. And my parents didn't know what to do with me. And then finally they believed me. And we were contacted because that's a whole other story of how he got a hold of us. But we did go to Boston and we were interviewed and hypnotized by him. So there's another thread in this very, very interesting story. So we are going to wrap it up for this particular show. I want to thank you, Ellen, for coming on 2 shows. Thank you so very much. You're welcome to come back anytime, so just let us know. Is there anything you'd like to say before we do wrap up the show?
It's just so wonderful to have you back. I missed your show, so thank you for coming back with us.
Well, and thank you for coming on. And Ken, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up this particular one?
Oh, I thank you for having another guest on that we can all compare notes together and share this with our audience.
All right. Well, again, if you want to look at what books we're talking about, you go to Amazon and you search Ken Sylvester, We're Not Alone, and Here's the Proof. And my book is called A Conversation with Extraterrestrials by Robin Alexis. And I do have 3 other books. One of them is called Spirit Lady, The Gift of Robin Song. That is where I talk about the experience that our next show will be, where I was abducted by Greys or Ebens. I'm not sure what they were, but it was the same night that Betty and Barney Hill, which is a very famous story, they were abducted in New Hampshire as well. So thank you. Everyone who's been listening to the show, I can actually feel the extraterrestrials from Zimbabwe coming in. I can see them clairvoyantly. They do want to speak, so maybe on the next show they can also get their 2 cents in and talk to us again. But for right now, everybody, if you want to be a guest on the show, you can email me at spiritladyrobin@gmail.com. And we do encourage you to look up at the sky. If you think you're seeing a UFO, please share your experiences with us. And we're just thrilled to be here with all of you. Thank you for listening to Mystic Radio. Choose love and let life's mysteries unfold. Namaste.